This is the LF-19 Basilisk, a lightweight, multi-role fighter airplane. With an advanced multi-role oriented interior, a high-fidelity fuselage and build, you could almost fool someone into thinking this was a real plane, or at the very least some sort of video game asset. But that's the fun part. It's not. This plane was built with a hyper-realistic, upcoming flight simulator game called Flyout. If you've been on my channel for more than like 4 minutes, I'm sure you know this. If you're new here, however, welcome to the channel. I'll be using Flyout for this build and for basically all of my other aircraft builds. With Flyout's public release just around the corner, there is much happening in the community and much prep work to be done all around. For you guys, I have a little roadmap of videos I'm going to release to familiarize everyone with the game, this being the first one. I'm going to take all of my silly little concepts aside and just build something from scratch. Not like any stupid, oh this is gonna ram something or whatever other nonsense concepts that come up with. It's just going to be essentially more normal builds. But the nice part about them all is that they are built completely from scratch from the beginning with detail and quality in mind. That plus I do plan on putting far more time into this build than some of my other builds. Essentially, our goal here today and in this time lapse is to build a Generation 4 light multi-role fighter. In case you don't know, the Light Multi-Role Fighter program was a program developed by the United States in order to fund, build, and operate effective fighter aircraft at a lower cost than previous aircraft such as the F-14 and F-15. Vehicles of the past, such as the F-14 and F-15, proved to be very expensive to operate, so the United States specifically looked for aircraft with similar or expanded capability for a cheaper price. These aircraft also needed to be able to conduct ground strike operations, hence the multi-role title. This program resulted in some of the most iconic aircraft in the world, such as the F-16 and F-18. But before we dive into the explanation of those programs and my design choices, let me tell you why I wanted to build this thing. The answer is pretty simple. What I am building today, while it has its goals, isn't exactly for a specific purpose. It's more or less a broad vehicle that encompasses many iconic features that people have come to expect from fighter aircraft. It's also meant to show off just exactly what you can do with Flyout. As an even further abstraction, I more or less wanted something to work on without a time limit. Today there are no limits. I plan on showing you everything I've learned about the game so far with these builds. As you guys may know, the software I am using to build this aircraft is known as Flyout. Flyout at the moment is scheduled to be released in the very near future. I did mention this earlier, but you see, Flyout is essentially a hyper-realistic aircraft design game. The problem is, when it's released, a lot of you may struggle to build a few things. The reason for this is what I'm calling the Flyout equation. It started with my friend Jamie, or Jag on the server, telling me that after about your first 3 builds, you generally have a handle on the game and you can build just about anything. Of course, that doesn't mean you'll understand the input system, or flight performance, or how to make a good engine, or how to optimize your lift, or anything like that, but you will understand how to shape things and how to build things. But that's not exactly all there is to it. Like I mentioned, at least understanding basic flight physics is sort of a necessity. Center of mass versus pressure, basic engine and wing aspect performance, things like that are essential to building at least competent designs. But lastly, if you ask me, the most important part of these builds is you, the creator. The time and effort you put into these aircraft is a direct reflection of how good they're going to be. And some of my videos as of late, I haven't put too much time into them because I haven't really had that time. But here's the thing, the next 5 or so builds may be the highest effort builds I've done yet, so you guys can have some fun and test them around when the game releases. I'm going to make a relatively detailed build of almost every aircraft class. So instead of trying to be consistent with uploads, I'm just going to take a little bit of extra time to build these. And time I took. This build, for example, took me well over 20 hours total. In order to create the time lapse and make it watchable, I cut a lot of the building footage out with me finicking with all the mini details of the aircraft. That's the amazing thing about this so-called Flyout equation, and Flyout as a whole though, the more time you put into each design, the better your design is going to be, and that's almost always a direct correlation. You can spend, if you want to, 20 minutes building some speedy build that looks kinda crappy, or you could spend hours upon hours making your masterpiece, your magnum opus of flying vehicles. Today, Flyout community, I want to show you what you can truly do with this game. Not make some corny flying machine with my wild world building and creative ideas. Today, I want to make what can only be described as a work of art. But all great things must have a humble beginning, right? So today, I tried to make something as broadly appealing as possible. This Gen 4 lightweight multi-role fighter. Nothing crazy or super futuristic or wild, but something we all know and hopefully we all love. And for the next few builds, I reckon we'll be doing something similar. Though, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the design of the aircraft. The aircraft is meant to compete in the lightweight multi-role fighter program, the same program that yielded such aircraft as the F-16 and F-18. Essentially, the goal for this program was to yield a multi-role fighter that could compete in air-to-air or air-to-ground missions with high effectiveness while operating at a fraction of the cost of other similarly classed aircraft such as the F-14 and F-15. You see, both the F-14 and F-15 are fantastic aircraft, but they're super expensive to run, and that's the problem with them. Aircraft such as the F-16 and F-18, however, are a good amount cheaper and are built with maintenance and cost effectiveness in mind, making them far more effective in the long run, at least theoretically. So today we would be taking on that exact same challenge. So finally, let's explain what I am building here today and how it aims to accomplish all the goals of at least a general multi-role fighter aircraft, and also the detail level that was present on the aircraft. So let's get on with it. The first thing to discuss was the airframe. From there we'll work on the engines, the avionics, the pylons, and finally the cockpit. If you want to skip this part and listen to my far briefer explanation and just flying the thing, I'll leave a timestamp in the comments for you guys to skip ahead because there is a lot to talk about. But with that out of the way, the airframe was actually kind of an interesting story, as this vehicle initially started as a single engine design and was eventually redesigned to have two engines fairly early in the design process. That's already passed on the time lapse. Due to both the intake setup and for the sheer purpose of redundancy, the aircraft seemed to make more sense with the twin-engine setup in my mind, as the redundancy allowed for a broader range of missions. Also, these aircraft were designed with efficiency somewhat in mind, as top speed was not on the highest list of priorities, but was still a very good thing to have. Again, this thing was a multi-role fighter, not an interceptor. A good amount of loiter time was required for such an aircraft. The aircraft also featured an incredibly long leading edge extension in order to generate as much vortex lift as possible. This vortex lift would allow for a highly increased maneuverability in the high alpha bracket, as well as moving the center of pressure far enough forwards for extra lift bonus through what we call relaxed stability. Essentially, this aircraft would have a similar fly-by-wire setup to that on the F-18 or F-16, where the elevators would not fully deflect in a turn in order to keep the plane under control, which would also, coincidentally, increase lift on both the nose and the tail, allowing for more maneuverability at just about any speed. At maximum, this thing could pull up to about 60 degrees alpha, but it was limited to about 30 degrees maximum without disabling the AOA/G limiter. The aircraft would feature swept main wings and actuating slats to enable the most lift possible at any speed. It would also feature a V-tail design very reminiscent of the F-18 in order to increase low-speed authority over the aircraft. Lastly, for lifting surfaces at least, the aircraft would feature two sawtoothed horizontal stabilizers. If you're wondering what a sawtooth is, let's take a look at the horizontal stabilizer on the tail of the F-15. Notice how it extends outwards at a sharp angle about halfway down the control surface. Essentially, this just generates an extra vortex over the control surface and allows for extra lift at high alpha, therefore allowing for more control authority over the aircraft, while also reducing the flutter over the control surface from air at higher velocities. Due to the relaxed stability nature of this aircraft, having a solid tail authority was a priority, and therefore I deemed it a reasonable design choice to include the sawtooth, even if the elevators wouldn't actually be pulling that much AOA. For the engines of the aircraft, two moderate diameter, two-stage afterburning turbofans were included on the aircraft. With a moderate bypass ratio and a pressure ratio of about 28, these engines were relatively efficient at most speeds, allowing for an impressive ferry range that I test a little bit later in the video. I'll show you guys that with the stat card. The engine diameter increase from aircraft such as the F-18 allowed for a considerably higher speed, as well as a slightly better thrust to weight, therefore finding its speed and climb rates more similar to that of the F-16 or MiG-29. Of course, the intake design also featured boundary layer diffusers and vents for said diffusers over the top of the wings. Essentially, if you don't know, the air going alongside the fuselage of an aircraft is all bumpy and dirty and low pressure and garbage. It's not good for an engine. It's really bad for an engine, actually. So when you see the gap between the intake and the engine, this is essentially designed to place the intake a few inches away from the fuselage and all that dirty air. Instead, it receives all that clean air from the outside world. That dirty air would be vented through the sides and the top, that way it didn't, build outside the intake and cause more problems. In case you didn't know, that's why all the intakes have a little gap between them in the fuselage, special exception for DSI aircraft like the F-35. Also, thanks to Bass Eater and friends, I now have an input system that allows for fully actuated gear bay doors. All you have to do is hit G or the landing gear button and they go up fully on their own, fully timed and everything. Even the landing lights automatically turn off when the gear retracts. As mentioned earlier, the avionics suite would include a relatively relaxed stability design. Essentially, that means we'd be setting up a fly-by-wire system to increase stability, but not so much that the aircraft is completely limited. You'd still be able to pull 30+ degrees alpha handily, and if you need to, the system can be turned off. The aircraft also included all the avionics and electronics you'd expect to see present in a modern design. An EW suite was placed on top of the right vertical stabilizer, with a balancing mast placed on top of the left one respectively. Respectively, my bad. This is a similar setup to what you'll see on the tail of the F-15, for example. Also, data link components were included in the nose. We had bird slicers, or more commonly known as just IFF transponders, were included in front of the cockpit. Essentially, whenever an American specifically radar sees a target, an interrogation signal or a specific frequency is sent at the aircraft. If the transponder sends the signal back, the radar knows the aircraft is friendly. This is, in a very basic sense, how we identify friendly aircraft in the air. So naturally, that was also included on the design. Avionics equipment such as pitot tubes, alpha indexer, static ports, and antenna for VHF, UHF, and GPS signals were also placed on the aircraft to give it just another touch of realism and immersion that really adds to the aesthetic while flying. And lastly, but certainly not least, was the cockpit. I designed many different panels, each with their own size and resolution, in order to include labels and textures which really made the cockpit come to life. A custom rate of climb, engine throttle, and oil pressure light was also added just for some more movement within the cockpit while you were flying. I kept in mind a custom cold start flow of left to right and then center while designing the cockpit, as well as 3 large buttons for air-to-air, air-to-ground, and ACM modes during combat. Since these buttons were centerline and separate from all the other buttons on the cockpit, they could easily be reached and pressed in emergency scenarios, therefore increasing the effectiveness of the pilots in command. With our aircraft finally fully developed and ready for combat, it was time to test it out and fly. See you guys in the air.
Never reminded, never taking whatever you told me. I know what I could be. Making emotion painful and so tell me, is this what you made me?
Alright, that's just about it for this thing. In air-to-air scenarios, the aircraft could carry up to 10 medium-range missiles as well as 2 short-range dogfight missiles on the wingtips. In this configuration, it was still capable of carrying at least 1 drop tank. In more air-to-ground configurations, it was also capable of carrying Mavericks, laser-guided bombs, JDAMs, and targeting pods, making it effective at all of its roles. We did a rather quick ferry range test on the aircraft. With 3 drop tanks, it could travel about a little bit over 3,000 kilometers ferry range. With 5 drop tanks, it could travel a little bit over 4,000 kilometers ferry range. With a clean load, the aircraft could have a top speed of about Mach 2.3 and a sustained turn rate of a little bit over 20 degrees a second. If you look at the EM curve of this aircraft, it's very similar to that of a MiG-29s, but about 2 degrees per second more in just about every aspect. Assuming the singular drop tank setup and full mill power, it had a loiter time of about an hour and 10 minutes. On burner, it cooked their fuel a little bit too quickly in my eyes, but otherwise was relatively balanced in just about every other aspect. As you can see with our gorgeously designed avionics, exterior fuselage, fairly well area ruling, fly-by-wire system, and full cockpit, this was just about the best plane I think I've ever built. I'll just fly around with it a little bit here for the outro, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Here's to all the glorious creations you guys are going to come up with when this game comes out, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.